Um, Folks know, if you've been to our network meetings in the past, that we do these about every other month, get together with our members from around the world and also others that we work hand in hand with to build this movement, to talk about what is going on in the world of war and the fight for just peace. What are the campaigns that you all are taking part in? How can we strategize together to build this movement against war? And what are some of the ways that the Resist US-Led War movement can help support your anti-war work in different parts of the world? So we're very happy to be here with you all, especially coming off a really successful campaign, just a couple of which concluded just a couple of months ago against NATO in Europe. And now kicking off into the fall, a large number of actions that are going to be taking place, um, uh, fighting against air shows, military air shows, and the glorification of militarization and war here in the United States, where I happen to be based, and campaigns against U.S. bases and the buildup to war in Asia, in the Asia Pacific, and so much organizing in solidarity with the people of Palestine who are fighting for their liberation and against genocide and occupation. So it's a really good time to be part of this movement and not alone in the work that we're all doing. So very happy to have you here. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. I think a lot of people have already been doing this. Please do introduce yourself in the chat so we get to know each other. If we can have our next slide, please. Um, at the beginning of our meeting, we usually do review what you can expect. We do think our meeting today will run about an hour and 40 or 45 minutes. So I hope folks can stay with us the whole time. After our welcome, we'll do a short political situation, which is something that we tend to do with most of our meetings, if not all, so that we can place the work that you all are doing, the work that we're doing together in the context of what is happening around the world in terms of war and militarism. So we'll start off with that. We'll have time to give updates or for our members to give updates on your different campaigns as they relate to the work that we do together on the anti-militarism agenda, or also new campaigns that you have going on. So we have a few members who are ready to share about recent or upcoming campaigns. Next on the agenda after that will be a discussion and presentation of new resources that we have available for members to use in your anti-war work. We're very excited to release these now or very soon. The fifth item is our planning for the International Day of Peace, which is coming up on September 21st, an annual day that this year, is just as meaningful, if not more meaningful than ever, given the state of the world. And we'd like to talk about what Resist has in mind and how we can plan for International Peace Day together. And then finally, part of what makes the Resist US-Led War network alive is our committees, which is how many of our members get involved with the work of Resist and helping to pull together research and educational materials or build the network and our tools for working together. So we'll have some updates from our committees and how folks can get involved with the work of Resist. And we'll close with that. So that is the agenda for today. We can have our next slide. So just want to welcome some of our new members who have signed on to Resist since our last meeting in June. It's very exciting that we have here organizations from around the world, from the US and Puerto Rico, from Korea, from Malaysia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and from the US. in many different types of organizations too. So very excited to welcome you all here. And I see some of you are here. I see your names in the chat, so it's great to welcome you all. This is also a little plug for anybody here who may have some capacity to do interpretation in the future. As we build out our network, we know that we'll be needing interpretation in many more languages. If you have that skill to offer, please let anyone in the Secretariat know. And we would love to bring you on board to our interpreters pool. All right, so let's plunge into the beginning part of our agenda, which is our political situation and education. So if we can have our next slide, thank you. So global political situation, there's so much happening in the world. And for Resist, often we focus our political education on particular campaigns that we're working on. We might look close up at one region of the world. At this time, we thought it would be a good idea to kind of step back and look at the world from what we call the three different main fronts of US-led war, which we've defined as in Eastern Europe, and in particularly looking at the US Western Alliance and NATO against the US and its closest allies in the West have defined as its primary enemy, Russia. The second front of war being the US, Israel, Gulf, and Turkish alliance against its primary adversary in the region, Iran. And then in the Asia and Pacific region, the kind of web of alliances that the US has built with Australia and Japan and South Korea, the Philippines, and others in their fight against, their main adversary that they've defined to be China and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So I'd like to take a look at those three areas of the world. But as we know, they may be the main fronts that the US has defined in its war strategy, but it doesn't mean that war and militarization are confined to these areas. We know that war everywhere affects all of us in all places of the world. And so in our situationer, we'll try and touch on some other areas as well. And then finally, we thought it would be worthwhile to talk about what is the war looking like on peoples inside and on the borders of the United States itself. So inside the belly of the beast. So that is the outline for our global political situationer. I hope that that's clear and hoping for a good discussion with everybody. So we can go to the next slide. All right, so if we start with West Asia, I mean, I think everybody has been witnessing in horror the genocide that has been taking place in Palestine for the past almost 2 years now. We know it didn't start 2 years ago. We know that the occupation has been an ongoing project for, almost 100 years now, or really about 100 years. But that the past 2 years have been the intensification of that. So since our last network meeting in June, we've actually seen a lot happen in this region, and the crisis becoming even more severely inhumane and deadly to the people in the region, in Palestine and throughout the region of West Asia. But at the same time, we're seeing that the kind of facade of military invincibility, any legitimacy of the right of Israel to exist has actually crumbled at the same time. The US-backed Zionist entity has announced, since our last network meeting, that it is really trying to drive to empty out Gaza of Palestinians. It's carrying out a war of extermination in its expansionist quest to establish greater Israel and really redraw the map of the Arab world in West Asia. It's carrying out a war of extermination that's using bombings and forced starvation, famine, and ecocide in Palestine, alongside continuing missile strikes and assassinations in Lebanon and against Ansar Allah in Yemen. It has annexed more land in Syria and further dismembered that country to divide its people, using very deliberate tactics to try and divide people by ethnicity and religion, preying on divisions to divide the people. And in one of the biggest things that has happened since our last meeting, this so-called, preemptive war on Iran, or the 12-day war on Iran, with Israel first, and then the U.S. Also coming in with direct strikes on Iran, which is really, the most powerful regional adversary that the U.S. ultimately has its eye on. This war of aggression against all of West Asia really aims to completely get rid of the people who have the right to be there, who have, it's their land, but U.S. Zionist aggression is aimed at really redrawing that map. Aiming to steal access to all of the material resources and trade routes and of the region. And still, the liberation forces of the Axis of Resistance are waging an unrelenting fight in defense of their people's lives and self-determination, and really acting as this united movement against US-led war in the region. Okay, so I think, one of the conditions that is really important to expose right now is the forced starvation, famine, and ecocide happening in Gaza. I think the graphic on here doesn't give justice to the people, but it's also quite horrifying to see these numbers where you have the UN now finally, right, declaring the emergency of famine in Gaza, where you have, at least 1/3 of all of the people, a population of 2 million people facing famine. Another 58% facing emergency in terms of food, and then 10% in crisis. What this means, though, is that you have over 1 million and close to 2 million people not knowing, where their next food is going to come, where they're going to get that, and that they're facing this crisis of food insecurity. I think the slides have disappeared. Sorry, I was just looking in the chat here, where it was completely engineered. The crisis, of course, didn't happen overnight, although in some ways the mainstream media is painting it as if it just started to happen. Of course, this has been building up over many years of a policy of starvation of the Palestinian people by the Zionist entity. But compounded over the past 2 years of the cutting off and blocking of the humanitarian aid, preventing it from coming through, and then also the very deliberate targeting of the food production systems in Gaza and also in the West Bank, so really in all of Palestine, where the Zionist entity has uprooted the traditional and kind of native plant and food systems to replace with others that are not sustainable, not allowing and stealing seeds and uprooting plants and crops, destroying water systems, and then, of course, kind of the obvious bombings and missile strikes and total destruction of the land so that it isn't capable of producing food. All of these have come to a head to create a situation where you now have close to 2 million people facing starvation and people dying of starvation every single day. And we're seeing and witnessing the pictures on screen, and knowing that this is a very deliberate a tool of war, no matter what the Zionist entity tries to say. I don't know if folks also may have seen some news recently where they're hiring influencers to go in and say that there's no starvation here. People have access to so much food. It's such a sham, and that they even have to try and do that because everybody knows it's a lie. The farce of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation put up by the US and Israel to really control who gets to bring aid in. And, the statistics of, over 1,600 people being gunned down as they go and try and get the aid from the GHF. So they're death traps. And then, recent threats of complete invasion and occupation. So no longer even hiding the true intent of Israel and the US in this whole thing. Trump still continuing to back the Zionist regime in all of this. If we can have the next slide, the bottom bullet point on that slide is talking about ceasefires, but I think, oh yeah, okay, sorry. So here's some of the photos there. Ceasefire negotiations are ongoing. I think what's important to say here is that even the ceasefire process is a very clear demonstration of the ways in which the US and Israel use ceasefire negotiations also as a tool of war. If folks can recall, at the beginning of the year, Israel and Hamas had struck a ceasefire deal, which didn't last very long, which was violated by Israel at least 350 documented times in the short period of the ceasefire, and ended abruptly with continued fighting. If we look back at the history of the way ceasefires have been used by Israel, it's actually pretty clear, and that it's a tool to be used to advance their actual aims of expanding territory under a guise of, extending the hand in peace. Resist put out a statement and kind of a little primer on ceasefires. I encourage folks to check it out because in looking at the history of that, you really see how they're used as a tool of war by the people who are waging imperialist war. We'll talk a little bit about how liberation forces use ceasefires to the advantage of the people. But it's important to know that as these current negotiations are going on, the interests of the pro-imperialist forces are always going to be not for the people, but for their own interests. If we can have just the next slide. Thank you for the I got the signal that I'm running out of time, so I'll speed up. So the next major flashpoint in the West Asia region that we wanted to talk about is Iran. So we know that the so-called 12-day war happened. The U.S. actually went in and used, its went in directly and made strikes on Iran under old arguments about needing to go in preemptively because of getting so-called intelligence that Iran was creating a nuclear weapon and was going to be doing its own strike on Israel, which have been thoroughly debunked since then. But in the conduct of that war, we actually saw how Israel's weaknesses were exposed. There were real strikes that Iran was able to make on military targets in Israel, and the faulty intelligence that Israel had in trying to conduct its strikes in Iran. And who came out ahead, who gained the most in this whole thing when you were able to when at the end of it, we saw that Israel's, goal, so-called goal of going in quickly, having the so-called war be over in a matter of days, with the defeat of Iran, did not happen, wasn't even close. So, who really came out ahead in this thing? Um, and then finally, just pointing out on this slide here, the bottom left-hand corner, of course, there are always these economic interests that are, kind of at the base of these different wars that are being waged in the region, for territory, for geopolitical position, for actual minerals and resources in the area. Soon after the the ceasefire here, or the ending of this particular war with Iran, there was a deal that was struck between and brokered by the U.S. Between Azerbaijan and Armenia for what is called the Zangezur corridor, which would which creates a kind of an economic corridor between Azerbaijan down to Turkey, allowing exclusive development rights to this corridor where um, uh, or, okay, so let me back up. In this corridor, it was a transit corridor for trade to go through. But in order to develop it, it actually needs, yeah, just infrastructure and so forth to be built. And it's all along a border between Azerbaijan, I'm sorry, Armenia and Iran. And who was granted the rights to develop that corridor, the infrastructure of it, was actually companies in the United States, and the U.S. I'm sorry, being given exclusive rights to kind of guard that corridor, and so now you have and will have U.S. Military forces being able to be stationed along this corridor that borders Iran. And so, part of what we see here is a positioning of the United States, trying to gain access in the region, brokering other deals, and being able to be as close to and kind of in this provocative position along the border of Iran. Um, so this is, another aspect of this war, which isn't always talked about, but is also an important part of the equation of why the region is important, and kind of the economic deals that are behind some of the aggression, or the aggression here. If we go to the next slide, and then I'll wrap up it so we can get to the next place in the fronts of war. If we can then go to the next one. With the ceasefires, I did, mention already that you have Israel and Hamas negotiating, not directly, but through Oman and Qatar. And Hamas, already saying they agree to the terms of the ceasefire that have been put on the table. So really showing that they actually want to have this break in the fighting. Israel saying, no, they're never going to accept it. They're going to go forward with their invasion of Gaza. And so, who's really seeking peace and who is really pushing forward and for more war? If we can have the next slide. On the side of the people and the resistance forces, how do resistance forces use ceasefires? We can just back up to the previous slide. It's, for a break in the fighting. So far, the resistance in Palestine has used them to free hundreds of political prisoners. So for real important gains and victories. It's also for a respite in the fighting, to regroup, attend to the needs of the people, and give that break. But they go in knowing that it's not fundamentally changing the problems of the region, that will take the liberation of Palestine from the Zionist occupation to really achieve that. But the ceasefire can result in some relief and actual gains. So if we, next slide, please. So that's what I just mentioned. And still, the resistance continues in many forms, despite the, continued genocide. Of course, key in it all is the resistance within Palestine and the region itself, the armed resistance that continues. We don't get to hear about it in the news much, but there's actual, victorious strikes and battles, such as this one that just happened a few days ago, an attack on an Israeli base in Khan Yunis, which, again, you hear that, the Zionists are indefeatable and are going to, be able to just run over Gaza, but the resistance continues, and that is kind of the decisive factor in this. But at the same time, and if we go to the next slide, you have support from outside as well. And what can we do as people outside of the region to be in solidarity and support? There's a huge flotilla that is going to be launching from Spain at the end of the month. So far, 44 countries or delegations from 44 countries have agreed to be part of this huge flotilla to try and go in and challenge the blockade in Gaza. It's the largest that's ever been mounted. There's mass mobilizations that are continuing in places around the world. There's the boycott, divestment, and sanctions calls that are also expanding worldwide. And then the International People's Tribunal, which will be taking place this fall, mounted by the International League of People's Struggle, which will focus on bringing into a court-like setting evidence of the ecocide, the forced starvation, and weaponized famine that the Zionist entity is committing against the Palestinian people, and try to exact justice in another form against that genocidal onslaught. So the resistance continues, and we're part of that resistance through our solidarity. So with that, I'll pass it on to our next Secretariat member, who will talk about the next front of war, which is on Europe and Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rhonda, for such a comprehensive, analysis of political and economic aims of the imperialists in the region, and also, of course, most importantly, the people's resistance to those aims. I'll be talking a little bit more about first the Eastern European Front of US-led war against Russia, and then a little bit about Asia and the Pacific and the preparations of war against China on the side of the US. I think that this front of war has been, the Eastern European front of war against Russia has been in the news a lot lately, particularly mainstream media. I think Trump and Putin, as I think it was heavily on the news again, met in Alaska, and there was a whole red carpet situation. All of this like media attention making Trump, or framing Trump as this like man of peace, right, that wants to end all wars that were started by the Democrats. But that in reality, this rhetoric that Trump is trying to portray is not all the truth, or not even a single ounce of the truth. And I think it's important for us to analyze what is behind that meeting and the further militarization of Europe as well that the US is pushing. So maybe we can go to the next slide. Yeah, I think to begin, important to understand that the war in Ukraine is not just a war of good versus evil, but actually a proxy war, right? One that the US has a heavy hand on actually provoking and starting, from supporting a pro-US NATO coup in Ukraine in 2014, and then further encouraging Russia by promising Ukraine a NATO membership in 2021. And through all of this provocation, Russia did start the war against Ukraine, and the US, through its puppet regime in Ukraine, represented by Zelensky, that does not represent the real interest of the Ukrainian people, but actually the interests of the US and of Trump and of the Democrats, has, gone into war against Russia, which has caused, as people might know, thousands of people being killed and really huge devastation on both sides, both Russian and Ukrainian people being affected by the war. And if we understand this war as a proxy war, we also see that this Alaska Summit, as they call it, really is exposing the nature of this war as a proxy war even more, right? Putin and Trump were the ones that met to actually discuss the terms to end or continue this war in terms that are acceptable for both financially and politically for US and Russia, and not the Ukrainian people or none of these sides that are also involved in the war, but actually a war that has been waged by and backed by US and Russia, and by Ukraine through its puppet regime backed by the US. So really seeing that the nature of this war as a proxy war, and that the US is using Ukraine to, counter Russia, one of its main adversaries in the world right now. And then I think on the other side, this whole narrative of Trump trying to end the war and really pushing the war on the EU is part of also the analysis of the three fronts of US-led war. The US, it's overstretched, is trying to fight people all over the world, trying to fight other imperialists, trying to fight people fighting for national liberation. And it is overstretched, right? It can't fight all these wars at the same time. And it's trying to find ways to actually push this war, push the burden of continuing this war to counter Russia into its puppet regimes, and like Ukraine and its junior partners in NATO, right? So if we go to the next slide, we can really see in the news in recent days and months how much the US has been trying to recalibrate its forces so that it can focus on other fronts, both against China and then in the Middle East, where it's facing the resistance from both the Palestinian people, the Lebanese people, the Yemenis people, and the Iranian people as well. So really trying to push the brunt of continuing this war to the EU, from trying to make the EU spend more on their defense budget for being a part of NATO, so a minimum of 5% of their GDP to be invested in its defense, from making the EU, the European Union, buy weapons for Ukraine from US arms companies. So really trying to still financially and politically push its agenda, but trying to keep its hands off and spend less money with it while still reaching its political and financial objectives with the war. And then I think another point to emphasize here, it's also that the US is using Ukraine and the war in Ukraine to also further its, test its weapons and its capabilities, right? So using this war that is devastating and taking the lives of tens of thousands of people to actually test its war, its weapons, so that it can use further against other peoples and against other imperialist powers in the future. So you can see that the US is still making deals with Ukraine around drones, and really making Ukraine this laboratory of drone development, and using this war to actually test it and continue to, further gain from this war in all of its fronts. And it does not really want to end its war, right? Or any of its wars. All these moves that we've seen here in the screen show that the US is preparing for even more wars, but it's actually trying to continue this war through the European Union even more. So yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. And then we get to the Asia Pacific now, which by the US own terms, it's its main front of war because it has its biggest economic competitor as China. So it's really trying to beef up its defense, its weapons in the region, and really trying to make deals and alliances with its partners, and once again, through its puppet regimes, right? So really using and putting the people of these countries like the Republic of Korea, the Philippines, and many other countries that are in the Pacific and in the Asia Pacific on the crossroads of a war that its people really never asked for, but that are going to be affected because these puppet regimes really are not serving the people of these countries, but are only serving the US imperialists for its own gain and not for its people. So I think we can go to the next slide. Want to go through a few examples to show how the US is continuing this build up to war against China. There is a myriad of examples. I'm going to try to focus on two main ones, the Philippines and the Republic of Korea. I think for the Philippines, a lot of things have been happening. Again, just with the headlines that are here, you can see US Congress is looking to set up an ammo factory and depot at Subic Bay, which was a former US military base in the Philippines that was ousted by the people, and now the US is trying again to set up a ammo factory and depot in the same location through this naval base that was ousted by the people in 1991. So the US named a lack of forward-staged ammunition manufacturing in the Indo-Pacific region, which essentially means we need to be more prepared for war against China. And we're going to use our puppet regimes that do whatever we need them to do to set up and prepare that. We can also see that this preparation for war is actually already impacting the people in these countries, right? So the Philippine forces is going to hold 500 military exercises with the US in 2026. That's, of course, more than once a day in a whole year. So there's going to be simultaneous military exercises happening in the Philippines in a lot of different days of the year. And there's not going to be a single day of the year, probably, that there's not going to be US military presence in the Philippines actually staging these exercises in preparation for war in the Philippines. And you can see even through the narration of how they're portraying this exercises. In past years, in the last decade, 5 years ago even, the US and the Philippine government even tried to portray these military exercises as defensive. But right now it's really, they're just saying, we're preparing for war against China. We need to be prepared if something happens. So they're saying it's going to happen and we need to be prepared. And of course, it's not going to happen. Well, the one major provocateur of war here is the US. So really seeing that the US is ready to go on war against China. And then I think last one, just seeing the US deploying the Typhoon missiles in the Philippines, which are missile launcher systems that really, where they are positioned right now in the Philippines, are able to hit mainland China. So I think something to also point at is that in the news, normally we see the news about this region as being Chinese encroachment in the West Philippine Sea. There was two vessels that just hit each other by accident, Chinese vessels in the West Philippine Sea. But really, and portraying China as this main force trying to push this war against the Philippines, but really seeing that the main provocateur of this war is the US. It's staging actual missile systems that can hit mainland China. And even though, yes, China is infringing in Philippine sovereignty on its waters, we really see that the ones that are the primary perpetrator of war here is the US and US imperialism, and therefore the importance of targeting US and exposing US imperialism in the region. Then we can maybe move to the next slide. We'll hear also from folks organizing around Korean liberation later in the presentation and in the meeting. Oh no, thank you. But also wanted to point out the war preparations within the Republic of Korea, seeing that the US, again, conducting several military exercises, unending military exercises in Korea that earlier this year actually hit civilian homes that are actually on the border with the DPRK, but are already hitting and damaging the people in the Republic of Korea. So you have these military exercises in the border of North Korea, infringing in North Korea's sovereignty, infringing in its desire for reunification, and its desire, and infringing in the desire of the people of Korea for peace and reunification, right? With the aims to actually, weaken this country that is defying U.S. will, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and also, again, threaten China with its military force. Also pointing out that the U.S. military has de facto control of the Republic of Korea military through its agreement. So really seeing that in times of war, the U.S. has total control of the Korean military, which, given that the Korean War never ended, also seeing that the U.S. has total military, total control over the Republic of Korea's military, and can do what it will with the people that are enlisting in this military and being forced to serve into the military, that is not actually a military to defend its country's right to sovereignty, but actually defend U.S. interest in the region. And then there's talks about reducing the U.S. troops in South Korea, but wanted to highlight that currently the U.S. has more than 20,000 troops in South Korea currently. So really seeing that the U.S. is already occupying Korea, right? It is de facto there. There's 30,000 troops that actually the South Korean government pays to maintain. So it's not enough to actually militarily occupy the land of South Korea. It still has, its government and its people still have to pay for this occupation. So highlighting, if you notice, the puppets. One ousted by the people, one still in power in the Philippines, but soon to be ousted for sure. Or the people are trying. Maybe we can move to the next slide. And then, like I said, those are two main examples, but the fight against U.S. militarization in the region goes far beyond these two countries. You can see some of the different materials that we put out concerning the resistance against these military exercises and build up to war against China. So Australia, the Talisman Sabre exercises just ended, and really again, U.S. military exercises to enhance its logistical capability to be more lethal, as they say, if a war and when a war with China breaks out. But of course, there were protests. People there in Australia don't want to be a part of this war as well. And then Japan, uh, last month was the 8th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and lots of different members of Resist have mobilized against it. Also seeing the push of the US to see Japan militarize again and be again a partner in this war against China as also an imperialist country. And then in Guam and the Pacific Islands, also the US occupying and having full control, continuing the colonization of these islands. And again, using these military exercises that degrade the environment, that make people feel like they are already at war, right? One that they, again, never asked for and seem to gain nothing from. Great, so we can go to the next slide. Also wanted to touch on recent developments in Venezuela. I know that Venezuela is not in the Pacific, but I think part of the analysis of the three fronts of war that Resist carries, it's also that these three fronts of U.S.-led war and the competition between U.S., China, U.S., Russia, and then U.S. Trying to get control of West Asia. These fronts are not restricted, or the impact of these fronts are not restricted to only those regions, right? So if folks have seen in the news, the U.S. has just launched warships near the coast of Venezuela and pointing out cartel accusations against Maduro, and it's really ramping up its narrative against the Venezuelan government, again, with the dire sanctions that the Venezuelan people have to face because they challenge the U.S. And its imperialist will, because the U.S. can see the largest country, the country with the largest oil reserves, actually develop and build wealth and redistribute it to its people. So it can't really stand a government that it's defending its sovereignty, right? So seeing those different developments and Trump and the U.S. government in general ramping up the militarization in Venezuela and in Latin America in general, we can go to the next slide. I think, yes, primarily because of Venezuela's defiance to the will of the U.S. and its defense of its sovereignty, but also seeing that these different developments and the U.S. putting even more and having more military presence in the region is also linked with its competition with China, right? Latin America has been growing closer and closer with the U.S. main competitor, which it's offering investments to these countries. It's offering infrastructure projects with different countries. And again, the U.S. needs to be the only power in the world because its imperialist class can stand to not profit. So really seeing that the relationship between China and the U.S. in the front of the Asia and the Pacific has impacts in the whole of the world, and it's even linked to the further militarization of Latin America and the impacts of and build up to more militarization in Latin America by the US. So yeah, maybe we can go to the next slide. Also wanted to highlight that in all of these contexts that people are resistant, of course, people are taking into their own hands to reclaim their rights to have their own history, to actually use the resources and the wealths of their nations and countries for themselves, and to build a peace that is not defined by what the US wants of peace, or a peace that is not just in condition of selling its wealth to the US imperialist class, but a peace that is actually for the people and built by the people. So you have here just a few examples again in Indonesia, resist members taking the streets to expose the legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the further sellout of its country to the US. We have folks in Guam, also members of Resist, calling for the cancellation of RE4PAC, the military exercises that just happened last month. We have the South Korean people demanding that they don't want war with North Korea, right? They don't want a president that is actually pushing an agenda that will bring them to war with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and actually winning and ousting this puppet president. And of course, in the Philippines, people are taking up arms and resisting this build-up to war, being a impediment to the Philippine government actually focusing all of its military on China, because it has to deal with the people resisting and fighting for a nation that is their own and free from the tentacles of US imperialism. So seeing that this further militarization also breeds resistance, and that the people are resistant in all these different contexts. And not pictured here, but also Venezuela also calling on its militias to defend the country, and seeing how the US is not wanted in any of these contexts. So I think that's it for the two fronts, and then I'll pass it again to Rhonda.
Thank you. So inside the belly of the beast itself in the United States. So we know that as the policies of the US, whether they're neoliberal or neoconservative, openly aggressive or covertly, that the people are paying the price, and that the people continue to resist. And that is also true within the borders and on the borders of the United States itself. We all know that Trump kind of campaigned on a platform of war on migrants, war on immigrants, and he backed it up at the beginning of the year with actual force, and then also money. In that recent big, beautiful bill, or the big, ugly bill, there was an allocation of over $170 billion for immigration and border enforcement activities that go to the Department of Homeland Security and ICE and Border Patrol, as well as the Department of Defense. The administration is also really systematizing and expanding border enforcement along the southern border with new national defense areas. So actually, being military designations along the southern border, allowing military forces, not just Border Patrol, but actual military forces to be involved in immigration enforcement. So they conduct patrols, they install barriers, they detain people, and then transfer them to law enforcement. So there's massive militarization at the border, and massive amounts of fascist crackdowns on migrants inside the United States, as well as on the border. Some of the things that we just wanted to point out that most folks here have probably seen already, are the two particular cases of Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. So in Los Angeles, very overtly coming down on immigrants and migrants, conducting raids at workplaces, going into communities, going into public parks, and terrorizing people, very intentionally terrorizing, even if they weren't conducting active raids where they were picking people up, detaining them, and even putting them into deportation. So a very clear provocation and real attempt to try and scare people and make them fearful of just existing in Los Angeles. I think some of the statistics I just wanted to mention because when you think about like just the numbers, it's almost astounding, right? Where you had at least 4,000 National Guard troops and 700 Marines on the streets of Los Angeles. And in raids taking place all around the city. It really became what they called kind of a ground zero for Trump's immigration crackdown, and very deliberately uh, targeting, some of the most vulnerable in our communities, people with mixed status, people with who are undocumented, and then just picking them up, kidnapping them, and taking them out and deporting them. And then more recently, just over the past month, the militarization of Washington, D.C. So sending federal police and military personnel to patrol the streets of Washington, D.C., with officers from at least 15 different federal agencies, Secret Service, Homeland Security, ICE, the FBI, the Marshals, and then now trying to recruit National Guard from several different states to militarize Washington, D.C. So, what does it mean to us? It means that the Trump administration and the powers that it represents, the class that it represents, are actually knowing that the people do not agree with their agenda, are actually opposed to it, and will resist. And so they crack down even harder to try and force their not only unpopular, really detested, right? Detested agenda. But the people continue to resist. We saw people conducting community watches, cop watches, migrant defense networks, many different ways that people are resisting and standing up against this kind of crackdown. On the screen here, there's a quote about a community or a headline, a community shutting down an ICE contractor in Louisiana, which, was trying to sneak in and conduct deportation proceedings early in the morning. Well, the community caught wind of it, blocked off the entrance to that ICE contractor facility and prevented them from bringing migrants in for their deportation hearings, at least for the day. So people are finding ways to resist and to stand up and not be scared of what's happening, and to really try and galvanize that movement in defense of the people against the militarization of this country. If we can just now show the short clip from an action in Washington, D.C., just to end on kind of the note of resistance and mobilization. That's right. So not being afraid, standing up, continuing to confront and resist. So thanks everybody for being part of this political education for today. I think we are actually out of time. I did see some questions in the chat, and then I noticed some of our Secretariat members were trying to answer them as we went along. Feel free to continue to put your messages and questions in the chat, because we can also try to type some answers in while we're continuing with the meeting, just so we don't lose time. And then also we can follow up with you afterwards. So, this overview, talks about the way the U.S. is waging war, and it's on its many fronts. But it's not, shouldn't feel overwhelming. In each front, we see resistance, and from wherever we are in the globe, we can take action regarding these different fronts of war and the ways that the U.S. is waging war. One tool that we can use in order to in order to wage our campaigns is our anti-militarism agenda, which puts out 14 calls that address the different fronts of war and the different ways in which war is being waged in the different fronts. So please do check that out. You can find it on our website. Talk to anyone on the Secretariat if you have questions about that. And yes, that's the conclusion of our political ed section for our agenda today.